So, born just 4 years apart, Vanbrugh and Thomas Archer had diverse careers that overlapped at several points. Surprisingly, however, there are few known direct mentions of Archer in Vanbragh's correspondence, and today I hope to explore the reasons for this, to provoke discussion about their friendship, and to underline just how connected these remarkable architects were. Now, this is not a place today for a general introduction into Archer, but it's worth pointing out that I gave a seminar, I think 2 years ago now, on Archer at the Axon Johnson Foundation, so I think it's still online, so if you are interested, go and have a look at that. The first obvious parallel is that the two men enjoyed successful careers outside of architecture, Vanbrugh with the military and as a playwright, and Archer with his role as groom porter, which placed him in charge of furnishing royal palaces and gambling across court and England from 1705. And I use this Hogarth illustration really just to illustrate the craze of gambling that took over Britain at the time. And I believe also this is where Archer picked up most of his architectural commissions around the gaming tables. It's also accepted that as well as creating some of the best known garden buildings in the country, both men crossed over into garden design, probably having some input into the landscapes that surrounded their work. And as educated, well-travelled gentlemen, they would have conversed easily with their patrons about the latest aesthetic fashions, Vanbrugh having spent time in India and France, and Archer having ventured further across Europe to Italy. And this ability to cross over into different disciplines would not have been seen as a mark of insincerity. On the contrary, would have displayed the breadth of both men's interests. Both were polymaths with intellectual capability to express their ideas in multiple genres. Their backgrounds are also similar. Arguably, Archer's descent was much more prestigious. His family had been lords of Umberslade in Warwickshire since the 12th century, whereas Vanbrugh, while descending partly from gentry, also had those mercantile roots that we were talking about earlier on his father's side. However, both had high enough birth that they could use these familial connections to advance their careers. Now, during my research, I put together an Archer family tree, initially to examine potential links to patrons. And an unexpected byproduct of this was the discovery that Archer and Vanbrugh were in fact distantly related by marriage. Archer's sister Elizabeth had wed into the Croft family of Herefordshire. And Vanbragh's father Giles had married Elizabeth Carleton, daughter of Lucy Croft and Sir Dudley Carleton. So I think this highlights just how much smaller the world was in this period. And even if the connection hadn't been through architecture, these men would have been thrown together through these familial connections. The first case of their architectural careers running in parallel was while Vanbrugh was engaged at Blenheim and Archer was at Heythrop, just 9 miles away, both from around 1705. Now, at Heythrop, Archer created a country house with distinct Roman Baroque detailing for Charles Talbot, the Duke of Shrewsbury, a very powerful Whig courtier and member of the immortal Seven Signatories who had invited William III to the throne. Now, Heythrop was not on the scale of Blenheim, but of course nothing was at the time. But it was a huge estate and landscape by anyone's standards, and a landscape that also, I believe, Archer played a role in creating. Now, Vanbrugh regularly commented on the progress of Heythrop, his letters providing evidence of him visiting the site. He noted to the Duchess of Marlborough in 1709 that he had been at Heythrop with the Duke and Duchess of Shrewsbury the previous Sunday. And after passing on their salutations, he noted that 'twill be with great difficulty for them to get the roof on this season. And as late as 1716, he was still reporting on the works. Now, I think it's important here to highlight the link between Archer's patron and Blenheim. Shrewsbury was one of the individuals whose architectural opinion was sought on the designs. Several rounds of drafts were shown to the Duke of Marlborough, who, in Vanbragh's words, then consulted his Duchess, Lord Treasurer Godolphin, the Dukes of Shrewsbury and Montague, and others in most of them. Shrewsbury's architectural opinion was clearly valued. Could this have irked Vanbrugh and encouraged a sense of resentment against Archer? If it did, Vanbrugh was discreet enough not to say so in public, and I like to think he must surely have realised that the problem lay with the patrons, not the architect. Certainly one could argue that Archer had the better deal with his patron. He could engage in a stimulating dialogue with his friend and in his friendship with Shrewsbury, who, like Archer, had been so inspired by the works of Borromini and Bernini on his Italian travels. Shrewsbury then supported Archer in his application to become Controller of Works in March 1713, describing him as possessing the best genius for building of anyone we have. Now, Vanbrugh eventually won out in re-securing the role, but the support Archer received was a stark contrast to the hostility that poor Vanbrugh faced with his patrons at nearby Blenheim. Now, the architects would have had regular contact in London. Their allocated lodgings as groom porter and controller of works respectively were in very close proximity within the former Whitehall Palace complex. Vanbrugh built his famous Goose Pie House on Whitehall Court sometime after 1700 and used one of the rooms upstairs as an office while working on Blenheim in 1709. Wren, as surveyor of the works, would have retained a permanent home and office there. And when in office as Lord Chamberlain, the Duke of Shrewsbury had rooms immediately next door to Archer, whose lodgings were on Middle Scotland Yard, shown at number 1 on this view. So within this very small area, there was a hub of individuals connected to architecture. And I think this must partly explain how Archer secured his place along Wren and Vanbrugh on the commission for building 50 new churches in London in 1711. Now, the minutes of that commission are businesslike, and they would never convey anything of any friendship between any of the commissioners, but they do provide evidence of Archer and Vanbrugh working together. For example, in June 1713, it was reported that the surveyors, then Hawksmoor and Dickinson, were to peruse Mason's proposals and assess their prices before laying their report before Sir Christopher Wren, Wren's son, Archer and Vanbrugh at Wren's house the following week. And I think we can all agree we'd like to be a fly on the wall of that meeting. And there are also records of Vanbrugh and Archer assessing potential church sites together across London. Now, the minutes also suggest that Archer commanded a great deal of respect from the commissioners, who treated him with an almost exaggerated politeness. Clearly, no one wished to fall out with anyone so connected at court. And it seems that his position as groom porter boosted his status above others, perhaps even Vanbrugh. In his lifetime, Archer was very much considered an equal to Vanbrugh and his peers, and this is a fact that has not translated always into modern architectural history, with Archer often relegated to the sidelines, perhaps even more than Vanbrugh. The minutes also show that the two men worked particularly closely on Archer's church of St. John's, where the location on marshy ground next to the river caused continual issues with the foundations. In August 1713, the commission secretary was to write to Archer, acquainting him that Mr. Vanbrugh would wait on him at a convenient time to settle the foundations of the church, and that both men would be desired to attend the next meeting to report their solution. Clearly, the pair together were considered a formidable architectural force. Eventually, Archer went so far as to obtain permission to dig near Westminster Abbey in order to assess what foundations it was built upon, and based upon that research, he built St. John's on an ingenious double raft of logs sunk into the site, with then 2 sets of foundations constructed above, and it's still standing today, happily. It's fascinating to imagine the two men collaborating to solve this problem. Now, Archer and Vanbrugh returned to building on neighbouring estates in the 1710s, directly recalling that earlier relationship between Heythrop and Blenheim. This location this time was Dorset, at Chettle and Eastbury, respectively, and the proximity this time was staggering. The estates were under 2 miles apart, and their boundaries directly adjoined. These literally were neighbouring estates. The vast Eastbury was begun around 1716 for Bub Doddington and continued under his nephew after 1724, whereas Archer was probably engaged at Chettle slightly earlier, shortly after 1711, when the estate was inherited by his patron, George Chaffin. But it's remarkable to think that in this remote enclave in Dorset, an explosion of the English Baroque was occurring, led by 2 of the nation's most idiosyncratic architects of the time. Working with Charles Bridgeman, Vanbrugh created a landscape of magnificence at Eastbury that included 2 garden buildings, both leaning more into the Palladian character, and formal canals supplied by an engine worked by horses. In contrast, and again mirroring the relationship between Blenheim and Heythrop, Chettle reached nowhere near the same level of extravagance. It was not until 2015, during the restoration of Chettle, that a spectacular Baroque reflecting pool was created, finally bringing a formal water element to the estate. However, I believe that Archer designed Chettle with an appreciation of its location adjoining Eastbury and was keen to acknowledge a link between the 2 estates. Each facade of Chettle has a curved corner closet that addresses a different considered vista across the landscape, and a gallery within the stair hall on the eastern front, shown here, acts as a viewing platform to the east. Now, crucially, the room over the western entrance was probably used as a prospect room, allowing long views down the main avenue that aligned directly on Eastbury. I also personally think that the east front of Chettle that I've shown up here, with its round-headed windows and bold banded stone rustication, has a very sort of deferential stylistic nod from Archer to Vanbrugh. Now, this modern aerial view of Chettle and the remains of Eastbury shows just how close the estates were, with the dividing line along that tree line. So here I've just transposed landscape plans, broad landscape plans, onto the views to clarify their orientation and scope, with the avenue aligning on Eastbury. Dare we imagine that the two men met and discussed their work when in Dorset? Archer was living not far away at Hale at this time. The restoration of Chettle that I was lucky enough to work on included landscape research by Dr. Kate Fellis, and she certainly thought it feasible that, I quote, Vanbrugh rode up over the hill to Chettle to see how his friend's project was progressing, perhaps with Charles Bridgeman in tow. It's entirely in the spirit of the way that 18th century landscapes were created that Chaffin and Archer met Vanbrugh and Bridgeman in an informal council of taste. This wonderful vision underlines that key concept that is often forgotten when approaching garden design and architecture of this period. And I think we've touched on it quite a lot today already. Gentlemanly discussion and collaboration would have been commonplace. And coming back to that earlier point about both men stepping over into garden design, there would have been no perceived separation between a designer of buildings and a designer of the landscape surrounding them. Hopefully, at Eastbury, Vanbrugh would have enjoyed a much more pleasant engagement with his patron than at Blenheim, as they discussed their designs with their neighbours. A further instance of Archer and Vanbrugh's architectural paths potentially crossing was at Kimbolton. Now, Vanbrugh's remodelling of the medieval house for Charles Montague, the fourth Earl of Manchester, is well documented, starting with the south range from 1707 and spiralling into that complete refacing. But what of Archer? Now, the portico on the east front was for many years assumed to be the work of Alessandro Galilei, who corresponded with Montague and produced a drawing of the portico. However, in a 2006 article, Simon Thurley highlighted a newly discovered travel journal from 1727, which clearly stated that the portico was built by Archer about 10 years ago, leading him to conclude that Galilei's drawing only proposed ideas for some of the detail and the steps. Now, Thurley's attribution to Archer was accepted by Howard Colvin and Giles Worsley, yet Archer's potential involvement remains little known. I think stylistically this revelation makes perfect sense. The east portico is a toned-down version of those on Archer's Church of St. John, and the design is not overtly Baroque, as arguably anything more flamboyant would have jarred with Vanbrught's really quite relatively recent work. Instead, Archer's edition was Baroque in its scale and proportions, but pared back in his detailing, I believe as a mark of respect for Vanbrugh. So why is Archer not mentioned in Vanbrught's correspondence? Should this be taken as evidence that they did not get on? I think this is up for debate, but personally I don't believe so. Rather, Archer's absence reflects his need as groom porter in charge of gambling to avoid and transcend court politics. Vanbrugh and Archer's political lives were seemingly very different, at least publicly. Vanbrugh, as we know, is openly Whig and a member of the Kit Kat Club, whereas Archer's views are ambiguous. His appointment as groom porter was under Queen Anne and a Tory majority, and his brother Andrew was a Tory MP, if a slightly whimsical one. However, his initial rise to favour in the 1690s was in the period of the Whig junto, and several of his early patrons were important Whigs, including some of the Immortal Seven, and this included Shrewsbury, as we've already discussed, and the Duke of Devonshire, who left Archer £200 in his will, in thanks for picking up the pieces at Chatsworth after Talman left. Archer's political ambiguity was likely purposeful, the lifelong term of the groom porterage requiring him to ingratiate himself with the rich and powerful under any parliament or any monarch. He would have needed to remain relatively neutral in his political beliefs, or at least very careful about discussing them in public. Indeed, Archer remains frustratingly elusive in all documentation of the period, not just Vanbrught's correspondence, perhaps a result of this need to be all things to all men. Interestingly, the Duke of Shrewsbury was also known for his ability to have friendships with politicians of all opinions, a skill that Archer perhaps looked to for inspiration. If you think Vanbragh's correspondence is light, you should try studying Archer. It's quite a challenge. So I hope today that more evidence of their interactions will come to light, offering proof that these two architects, whose careers were inherently intertwined, enjoyed a quiet, unpublicised friendship bound by their love of building. I've realised today I've probably raised more questions than I have given answers, but I hope it will encourage debate into the future. Thank you.